Thank you so much to Royal Museums Greenwich for hosting this really important event this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with Tatiana Filievska, from the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute, who's given us so much inspiration over recent months to create this event that's currently happening over the bank holiday weekend at the Old Royal Naval College. Discover Ukraine, Bits Destroyed, which has been a process that started with our conversation with Marina Pezenti, who was introduced to us by the Royal Borough of Greenwich. And through that, we gradually developed the project with the extraordinary digital artist Thais Poda, who's with us as well, arrived on Friday from Ukraine, whose work this is, which I know some of you may have seen, and many of you will be seeing later today or tomorrow. I'm going to let others talk about the work, but in terms of the context of Greenwich+Docklands International Festival, this is probably the most important work we've ever done. We're all about the celebration of culture in public space. This lecture at the Royal Museums Greenwich and the artwork at the Old Royal Naval College take place inside a World Heritage Site. And if a World Heritage Site has any meaning at all, it's to stand in solidarity with culture beyond borders everywhere. And at this moment in time, Ukrainian cultural heritage is a target. It's under unprecedented attack in the Ukraine. So it's up to all of us here to stand in solidarity with Tatiana, the people of the Ukraine, in ensuring that we remember and we support artists, cultural workers, the people of Ukraine at this extraordinarily difficult time. But I'm going to pass now to Tatiana, and just wanted to say thank you very much to Tatiana, the Ukrainian Institute, the British Council. This event is part of the Ukraine-UK season, the Arts Council England, and the Royal Borough of Greenwich. Thank you very much, Tatiana.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bradley. Thank you all for coming today. And we informed you yesterday that unfortunately the lecturers themselves could not arrive due to the delay with the visa delivery. And I'm really happy that you agreed to come to see them online and hear us in person, giving you these introductions and having more conversation afterwards. And as we agreed to have this presentation of the projection that you will be able to see later on across the street on the beautiful Wren building, we decided that it would be extremely important to give more context, to give more information on why these mosaics are so important and what is happening to them now. Because the original artwork, this projection was produced several years ago in 2019, and the idea behind it was to show the importance and the value of the recent heritage from mid-20th century, something that was a contested heritage inside Ukraine, but was also an important part of our art history of 20th century. And since the 24th of February, the situation changed dramatically because a large part of the mosaics that are used in our projection are located in the eastern and western eastern and southern part of Ukraine, where the front line is. And as we had a small research done within the past months, we realized that at least a quarter of these mosaics have been destroyed or severely damaged. And, you know, since we know the war is still going to be for some time, and today the Ukrainian armed forces started a counterattack in the south of Ukraine and trying to save the city of Kherson from occupation, deoccupied, we understand that maybe even more mosaics will be lost even today, you know, as we are looking at these projections here in London. So we want to honor the memory of those artists who created these mosaics decades ago. And maybe majority of these mosaics will be lost forever. And everything we have are just the photographs, the images that were done by Yevgen Nikiforov, the Ukrainian photographer, and our animation that is celebrating the beauty and the unique value of these artworks. And I'm very happy to introduce and invite to join us online our artist Yevgen Nikiforov, the photographer, and curator and art historian Lizaveta German, who will deliver a presentation on the history and current state of mosaics of Ukraine, of the Soviet period from Ukraine. Enjoy the presentation, and after it's over, we will have time for the questions and answers and a discussion. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, even though we are not there. We're very sorry we couldn't make it on time with the visa, but we still appreciate a lot that all of you came today, because basically the visuals we're going to show will be the same as if we would show them while being physically present there. Thank you very much to Tiana Bradley for the introduction. We're very honored, actually, to give a talk to present something we've been, especially Yevgen, has been working on for many, many years. And we are thrilled that the topic of monumental art is now become a subject of interest for a wider audience outside of Ukraine. Well, let's have a look at it, actually. Okay. So here we are. Yep. Can you see it? Is it fine?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay, great. So our presentation today is called "Between Two Fires: Monumental Art in Ukraine." And first, perhaps allow us to introduce ourselves briefly, and then we will switch. I will give the first part, and Yevgen will continue with the second part. My name is Lizaveta German. I'm an art historian. I'm not going to tell about everything which I've done professionally. The most important point now is that I've been researching the art of Ukrainian 60s, of so-called unofficial art of Ukraine in 60s and 70s, and monumental art is, of course, a very important part of it. And I published a book about Ukrainian 60s 7 years ago, which was republished in English 2 years ago, and Jenny will talk about it a little bit. And I was also lucky enough to work along Yevgen and help him produce his amazing books about monumental art. And well, I do believe that now is a very good time to reconsider the Ukrainian art in generally, and I do believe that the 60s and the monumental art in particular would be one of the most amazing chapters also for the audience, both professional by the audience outside Ukraine, to discover.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yevgen Nikiforov. I'm a photographer, and one of my photographic projects dedicated to Ukrainian mosaics. For the last 8 years, I made the research in whole Ukraine and found around 5,000 of mosaic pieces all over Ukraine, and published 2 books about it. And I'll tell about it a bit later.
Mm-hmm. So let's get started. I will I will occupy the screen, and then Yevgen will join me. So that's just technically just easier than that if just one of us is in front of the camera, and then he will join us, but he will be staying next to me while I'll be speaking. So our lecture is called in Between Two Fires, and we can monumental art between two fires, and we can interpret, we can elaborate on this topic in many different ways, like in Between Two Fires, between the Soviet Union and today, between the fires of war, between two armies, whatever. But first, I would like to speak that I would like to start with this piece, with this literal depiction of the fire. This is a big mosaic panel at Mariupol Central train station. As you know, Mariupol is now actually occupied by Russian forces, and the city itself is almost completely destroyed. And here in this mosaic panel, we actually see the fire that helps the steel makers to produce steel. And this is the depiction of Azovstal, the the biggest factory at Mariupol, which became sadly famous for and became a tragic symbol of Ukrainian resistance and resilience, since the factory served as a shelter, as a place to hide for the Ukrainian army before the city was completely occupied. This is the sketch for the mosaics, which also show how the steel is being produced, and the steel making was the biggest pride of the locals, the people who lived in Mariupol. This is the central railway station of Mariupol. This is an archive photo back in Soviet times, and this is how this this train station looks like after being almost completely destroyed, and this is how the mosaics look like. As we can see, it's not completely destroyed, but it's basically needs a major restoration, and we hope one day it will happen. I would start my lecture. My part will be dedicated to a historical background of Ukrainian monumental art, so that you can have a little bit of broader understanding of the context. Of course, this introduction will be only a brief, because basically the phenomenon of monumental art, of course, deserves a longer and more profound lecture. But I hope, as an introduction, it will give you some thoughts, food for thought. So basically, originally, monumental art was a part of something which was called Soviet monumental propaganda. So the arts and culture for Soviet government was quite an important tool of promoting the political ideas, and monumental art would be was one of the major tools, because it was accessible, it was bright, it was huge, it was transparent, it could be accessed by broader audience all around the Soviet Union, and that's why the monumental art was very well funded and very well supported by Soviets. And what makes particularly Ukrainian monumental art interesting, because of course monumental art was being created also in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, and all these former Soviet countries have their own interest in schools. But what makes Ukrainian monumental school particularly interested, because the artists who were producing it, the artists who were commissioned these pieces, many of them managed to hack the system, if I may say so, and managed to bring much more broader and deeper senses into these pieces rather than just the propaganda. But of course, we cannot avoid the fact that the considerable part of this was dedicated to Soviet narratives, and we have here two quite self-speaking examples of it, with Lenin and this Red Army soldier. The second one, Red Army soldier, is now actually hidden. It's not destroyed, but it's hidden due to decommunization law, which we will speak about a little bit later. A part of just like straightforward Soviet images and narratives, of course, there were some other like major mainstream storylines, like the celebration of science, celebration of cosmos, of space exploration of Soviet Union, as we can see on this two pieces, and of labor, of sports, of education. So basically some storylines which are quite relevant even today, of course, because we can celebrate science. Well, we can celebrate science, of course, after the Soviet Union collapsed. And this idea of monumental propaganda was, in a very interesting and ironic way, deciphered by contemporary artist Zhanna Kadyrova. And here I would like to put a little bridge to contemporary art of Ukraine and show you the mosaic piece created in 2013 by Zhanna Kadyrova, one of the prominent and most interesting contemporary Ukrainian artists. She created this piece for the Pinchuk Art Center exhibition, and actually to produce it, she found some old tiles and smaller pieces to make it real, and created something which she called like a modern day contemporary monumental propaganda, which is a commercial. So this image, as you can see here, is a mock-up of some kind of a perfume commercial, perfume advertising, which she saw somewhere in Kiev being printed as a huge, like mosaic-like, huge size. And she made this ironic comment that there is always a propaganda, but in Soviet times it was of this kind. Now we have more like a capitalist kind of propaganda whatsoever, but the language, the formal language can be the same, basically. I would also like to give a couple of typology cases of how the monumental art, how the mosaics particularly were distributed, like a typical place where the average Soviet person could face this kind of art, because it was meant to be accessible by broader masses. It was meant to be decorating the places where the crowds would gather, and the public transport stations, like the one in Mariupol I showed before, but also here in Dnipro, for example, would be decorated by huge panels. And normally these panels, the subjects of these panels would be dedicated to some local story. For example, in Dnipro or in Mariupol, the big industrial cities of Ukraine, the main narrative, the main subject matter would be the industrial power, the industrial might of this place, the celebrations of workers, or some other local specificity like farming or fishing or any other kind of labor that would be especially popular in this particular area. But also mosaics were sometimes quite abstract, or of course the artists couldn't use the word abstract because abstractionism was officially forbidden as a creative method in Soviet times, but these abstract pieces were called simply decorative, and I will also get back to it and show how artists managed to hack this ban on abstract methods. So here we have, like this two very, very typical kinds of buildings where one could see mosaics even now: sport complex, public transport buildings, schools, factories, something like this, all around Ukraine. Also, a very curious example of how mosaic art was really spread around and could reach even the most remote corner of Ukraine is a public transport stop. So sometimes even in the middle of nowhere or in a highway with like just a little village or a little town nearby, one can still find interesting examples of mosaic art. Normally, this kind of pieces are anonymous, so we don't know the names of this artists, because public stops were commissioned to artists, and it was so to say, a good way to make money for the artists, because mosaic art was quite expensive in production because of the cost of the material itself. Smalter was very expensive. Ceramic tiles were less expensive, but still it demanded a lot of work, a lot of production efforts. So the artists who were skillful in doing mosaics were eagerly taking these commissions, even if they were anonymous, because this was a good way to earn quite a big money. But if we imagine that even in the most remote villages, one could cherish this quite beautiful, quite interesting pieces of monumental art, that also helps us to understand how much popular, how much spread, and this type of art was, especially in the 60s. Of course, the Kiev tube stations were massively decorated with mosaics, and the Kiev metro station was established in the 60s, and so it basically coincided with the most flourishing, the most active period in mosaics production. This is the metro station called Shulavska. Formerly it was called Bolshevik, then it was renamed after the Soviet Union collapsed, and here I allowed myself to add the recent photograph of this station, which now serves as a shelter, because Kiev metro stations were built with a double purpose. It's a station. It's a stop station for trains to stop, but also it was built as a shelter. And sadly now these shelters are again being used for this second purpose, and people actually hide there. So unfortunately, I don't know the author of this photograph, but I came across several ones in Ukrainian social media. A little bit of the history of what were the influences and what were the important historical milestones for Ukrainian monumental school to appear, as it were. So first of all, we could get back to the early years of the Soviet Union, when many of Ukrainian artists were still not disappointed in this regime, and with all their heart believed in the merits of socialism and in the merits of the future equality and democracy that the Soviet state initially promised. And many Ukrainian artists quite sincerely went on service for this political regime. And one of the greatest Ukrainian schools of early Soviet times is the school of Mikhailo Boychuk, who was one of the co-founders and professors of Kiev Art Academy, and also he was the head of the, let's say, big community of artists who preferred to work as a collective, as brigades. And one of the main directions of this brigade art were big murals, mostly murals, not mosaics, that were supposed to decorate again the public buildings all around Ukraine, again as this part of monumental propaganda policy. In the 30s, Mikhailo Boychuk himself and most of his school were executed, were killed by the Soviet regime. They were accused of being nationalistic and anti-Soviet, and along with many other artists, cultural workers, poets of Ukraine, they were killed. They were assassinated, and the considerable part of their artistic legacy was either removed or archived or simply destroyed. So now basically there is not a single mural made by this school out of many of them exists anymore, because it was basically destroyed by the same government that commissioned it and paid for that. We only have some easel works left, like smaller paintings left from this school, and here we can see another example of how they also worked with mosaics, just on a smaller scale, because this particular depiction of St. John, created by Mikhailo Boychuk himself, was actually a small piece, rather than experiment with this material than a sketch for something big. Another important historical point of reference would be, of course, the very important legacy of Byzantine mosaics that were created in Kiev Rus times in Kiev. And the most famous example is the most famous mosaic piece of work is located in the Saint Sophia Cathedral, the main cathedral of Kiev, established in Kiev Rus. And another famous example is the mosaics of Mikhailovsky Cathedral, which was located like right in front of Saint Sophia. But then in another important piece of mosaics made from golden smolder and smolder of many other different colors was created there. But in 1930s, again, the same period when the Mikhailo Boychuk community were killed, this mosaic piece was removed, and the reason for that was that Saint Michael's Cathedral, Mikhailovsky Cathedral, was actually destroyed, because the place where it was located was meant to be reconstructed completely to build a new headquarters for Soviet Ukrainian government. So this whole area was completely down to earth, was destroyed down to earth, and the cathedral was destroyed, the masterpiece of architecture of the 12th century. But the only good thing out of this was that the government allowed to make measurements of the cathedral in order to reconstruct it. And in fact, the cathedral was reconstructed in 2000s, but in a little bit different way that it was measured back in 1930s. But the mosaics itself was allowed to be removed, not to be destroyed, but to be taken out of the walls of the cathedral and brought to other places. And part of these mosaics were actually sent to Moscow, to Tretyakov Gallery. And the biggest part of it, this Eucharist composition, was moved to St. Sophia, to a part which serves as a museum now. And the person who was supervising the removal of the mosaics, and this is a very complicated, very careful process. This was what was the name of what was Volodymyr Frolov, the artist from Russia, actually, who was an expert in mosaics, and he was sent to Kiev to supervise this removal. And that's why we still have this very important piece on view. It's available. You can go to St. Sophia and to take a look at that. There is no there is no final documentation proof of that. But there is a version that the same artist, Volodymyr Frolov, he used the leftovers of smalto, which was left, or which was just fell out during this removal process, and he used this smalto to create this very mosaic that you can see now, this peacock, which decorated the building and the city center, which called Dniprosteria Cinema. This building, this cinema, was totally reconstructed in 2000. Now it is a puppet theater in Kiev. But the reconstruction of the building, during the reconstruction, they kept the wall with this peacock. So this peacock is still there. It's not visible. You cannot see it from the street level, but it's there. It's not destroyed. So there is a version, according to Yevgen Nikiforov, this is the very first Soviet mosaic, a public Soviet mosaic panel created in Kiev, the peacock, actually, which happened because the St. Michael's Cathedral was removed, and so there was like a historical tragedy which led to establishment of something new, which had its own consequences in the future. Another very important historical milestone for the mosaic art to flourish was the resolution of the Communist Party in 1955, which was the resolution was called on elimination of excesses in design and construction. To say briefly, before that, the architecture in Soviet Union was something like you can see on the left. This is so-called Stalinka. Like people call this type of architecture Stalinka because it was called this type of buildings that were built during the Soviet times. There are several buildings of this kind in Moscow. There is one, a very famous one, in the center of Warsaw, and also there is a couple of examples of such buildings in Kiev. And this so-called Stalin architecture, also sometimes called Stalin's Empire, was richly decorated, sometimes like even over-decorated. Again, very expensive in production and building, and especially after the war, this kind of architecture was very expensive. It demanded a lot of funds, but because after the war, the architecture was also the kind of an instrument to show the might of Soviet Union. The government still invested in this kind of architecture. But then when the Khrushchev government started, the architectural policy changed completely. And after this resolution, the Soviet architecture turned to something less grandeur, to something more practical, more cheap, and more fast in construction, because the country had to accommodate a lot of people who lost their houses during the war, and then some very simple and not very pretty, perhaps, kind of mass housing were introduced, and you can see the example of this mass housing on this slide. But to make these gray and not really interesting buildings a little bit more interesting and attractive, architectural studios, architectural combinats invited artists to decorate them, mostly with mosaics. And this would be the example of how this very simple and pretty ugly, to be honest, architecture was decorated with something quite beautiful. This would be another two typical examples of this Khrushchev, post-Khrushchev architecture. Here we can see a sport complex and the House of Culture, two very typical buildings. One can see the House of Culture and the sport complex in almost every, even the smallest town, and sometimes even the Soviet villages have their own sport complex and their own House of Culture. Sometimes it would be the only two a part of city council, the only two types of the buildings outside of the private housing. So, and these types of buildings were also decorated with mosaics, and these mosaics were very easily recognized. And, like, their subject would be obvious. The sport complex would celebrate the sport, and the house of culture would celebrate cultural leisure or different kind of cultural activities, such as playing music instruments or something like this, to promote basically people to visit it. Another very important milestone would be the establishing of the National Union of the specific monumental art department in the National Union of Artists of Ukraine. And the National Union of Artists was the main governmental body that commissioned mosaics and all other kinds of art. So the artists in Soviet Union, artists could only work officially, could only produce anything, exhibit anything, create anything legally if she or he would be a member of artist union. You cannot be an artist if you're not a member. You're just not allowed to produce art unless you are there. You have this membership. So most of the artists, including those who we now call the 60s or underground artists, they were actually the members of the National Union of Artists of USSR, because otherwise they would be just out of the system. And the Department for Monumental Art was responsible for holding the competitions, the public competitions, because the artist could be commissioned directly to produce something, or she or he could participate in the public competition. So, and the artist who initiated and who became the head of this department was the artist called Stepan Kirichenko. And here we can see one of his later works of the 80s, one of his most important works, which he co-produced with his son, also artist Stepan Kirichenko. And this is the panel celebrating the World War II, celebrated, of course, from the perspective of the Soviet historical narrative and the victory of the Soviet Union, as it was put in this narrative, was a was one of the most important storylines, especially in 80s, because the so-called Victory Day was not actually celebrated like immediately after the war. It was only introduced in, if I'm not mistaken, it's in 60s or even 70s. So, but then it has become one of the major, and it's one of the major narratives of Soviet propaganda, and it still is one of the major narratives of Russia, which addresses this narrative even in the present war against Ukraine. But what I want to pay your attention to in this particular panels is how actually the artists refer to the Byzantium style of Byzantium mosaics in the way they depict faces, in the way they depict the clothes with this many folds. And actually, this is a masterpiece of mosaic art, of mosaic craftsmanship, a very beautiful one, which for me, particularly, it's very convincing that these artists, no matter how sincere they were in taking the state-funded commissions, they also definitely had their own artistic goals while executing it. So for them, it was not only about serving the propaganda, but also to serve the art, the monumental art, and to create something beautiful that will live long after the state that commissioned it managed to survive. A couple of works about the 60s, which I'm always referring to. So every nation, every state has their own 60s. This is an international term, the international word to describe the moment of liberation, to describe the moment of flourishing of art and culture and youth and freedom. However, it was possible in Soviet Union, and in Soviet Union and in Ukraine in particular, the 60s were also the period of moderate liberations. I'm saying moderate because still the artists could not produce whatever they wanted to, but it was a moment when lots of literature, which was under the ban before, was published, and also lots of the many interesting artworks were created and exhibited. This moment, which we know as ottepel, as thaw, was quite short, because in the late 60s, the restrictions became even more strict than they were before, and the liberation period stopped. But still, 60s, this movement, this very useful and joyful movement, of course, had its impact on monumental art, because the most interesting artists, the most interesting producers of mosaics belong to this generation, and we can see some of them here. Bogdan Posadzki is not the mosaic maker; he's an architect from Greece. But I loved this photograph of him very much, because it also represents the spirit of 60s very much. Because it was definitely, as it was in UK, as it was everywhere. I think it was a generation of cool kids, so to say. The people who did believe in what they're doing. They did believe that their art could change the regime, could change the history. It didn't change it completely, but definitely it established a certain crack in the system, and this crack in the end, of course, it brought to the system collapse. And it's also important to say that in Ukraine, the sixth generation was also the generation of dissidents, the generation of people who were fighting not only through the art, but who were fighting by signing protest letters, by being sent to camps, but by participating in demonstrations and meetings against the Soviet regime. And this was a generation that really suffered. And the Alla Horska, one of the greatest monumental artists of Ukraine, I will also show her portrait later, was one of the rare artists who were actually killed, not for her art, but for her political views. These are the faces, actually. These are the faces of the artists behind the Ukrainian monumental art. Of course, there were many more of them, so I cannot really show you everyone in this presentation. But these are, I don't know if it's, I mean, maybe like this. These are the faces of them, and as you can see here, the faces are mostly belong to men. But and this is actually a very common belief that the Soviet art and Soviet monumental art was mostly masculine, and indeed the Soviet art was not very women friendly, so to say. But in reality, if we do a little, if we just look at the statistics, we will see that actually the Ukrainian monumental art also has a female face, because well, not number-wise, but quality-wise, most of the, not most, but many of the important mosaic pieces, also those which we already saw during this presentation, were created either by female artists only, or the female artists were a part of the bigger collectives, because mosaics were mostly created by collectives. Like, especially bigger panels, they demanded a lot of work, and to create a mosaic required a very hard, very exhausting physical labor. And here we have the most. Again, it's not the only female artist who did mosaics, but these would be the most important and the most famous from them. And I especially like this image of Alla Horska with her colleagues in front of the mosaic, which I will also show in a bit. And I like the way how actually, I do believe that she depicted herself in this mosaic, and this symbolic image of the fighter is actually her portrait, because she was a fighter. And as I mentioned before, she was one of the artists who actually gave her life to her political belief. Let's go further. So another important aspect I would like to pay your attention is how, and I mentioned this before a little bit, is that the artists of 60s, they managed to squeeze, to kind of illegally smuggle their artistic concepts into the monumental art. And the monumental art for many artists would be the only medium, the only possibility to publicly show what they were working on in a studio. So, for example, Alexander Dubovik, which is mostly famous for his painting, and he is still alive. He's in his early 90s. He's very active. He exhibits. Actually, now in Kyiv, there is a solo exhibition by Dubovik. So he's, I mean, I hope he will be active and working for another decade or even more. So he was doing abstract painting, starting from the 60s, and Of course, he couldn't exhibit none of this because the abstractionism was officially forbidden. So he could only produce it and to keep it in into his archive. But once he was commissioned to make a mosaic panel for the small secondary school in Ukraine, he applied something like this, which he produced. And the reason why he managed to get the permission to produce something like this was that it was not called abstract, of course, but it was called decorative. He just proposed some kind of a simple decoration, geometrical pattern with some bold color figures, something like this, and he could trick the system. He could hack the system, but there was a price to pay for that because there was also some kind of a how to describe it, like a budget guideline of the amount of the fee that the artist could receive for mosaics. Mosaics were very well paid type of art, so the artist could live for a year or a couple of the years using the fee received for one big mosaic panel. It was very well paid. But the fee also dependent on the kind of composition you produce. So for the composition with the human figures, realistic human figures, the artist would receive this kind of amount. But for the decorative pattern, the artist received, I don't know, I can't give you now the exact figures. Maybe Zhenya will tell it later. Like something like 5 times less. So the decorative patterns were least paid type of mosaic panel. But anyway, Dubovik chose to do it, and if you compare now this mosaic to his paintings, we can basically easily see that he smuggled his abstraction into a typical public Soviet school. This is the one of the biggest famous mosaics from Kiev. Here you can also see the actual scale of this art if you compare with the size of the car or the size of the human people on the street. And here I would also like to compare the sketch. You can see the sketch and you can see the actual mosaic. It's more or less similar, but here there is one curious detail. On the sketch, we can see on the lower left corner that there is some kind of also like a decorative abstract detail. I think this is a depiction of train because the whole composition is called Symphony of Labor. We can see different types of labor, physical labor here. So I think this is a crane, but it is again very, very abstract, very formal. And here on the final version, literally on the wall, we can see that this abstract detail had become a human figure. This is the mosaic panel in Krasnodon in Luhansk region. This part of Ukraine is temporarily occupied. This is perhaps one of the greatest mosaic panels ever created. It's beautiful. It's huge. It's very complicated. There are many. It includes malto, semi-precious stones. It's very complicated in the way it is used. And these are the sketches for this. And because if you at the first look, you can think that this is also quite social realist in the way it's made, because we can see these images of the fighters, quite realistically depicted. We can see this path of the whole composition, and this is called the Young Guard. And the Young Guard is again one of the popular narratives of the Soviet history. Young Guard is a part of the guerrilla movement during the Second World War. The young people who were fighting the Nazi army and who were killed, but because of their heroic fighting, they managed to do something good. And no one actually knows if this kind of the guerrilla group ever existed, because in the 50s, I think there was a film which was called Young Guard, and the film told the story of this guerrilla group. And the whole narrative about them. They're based on this film narrative rather than a real historical fact. So perhaps there was never real people behind this movement, but nevertheless, the mosaic piece celebrates this heroic part of the history. And but since we know that this panel was created by the artists, including Alla Horska, who were fighting the Soviet system whatever they can, we can also imagine that this was dedicated not to the Soviet story, but to anti-Soviet story. And the 60s artists, they depicted themselves. They depicted not the fighters for the Soviet regime, but they depicted the fighters against the Soviet regime. And this huge red flag behind their backs, that they are kind of presumptively, one of them is holding this flag. But I could easily interpret it because I've been thinking about this mosaic a lot, and I had text about it, like a more profound analysis about it. I assume that the real content is that they left this red flag behind, and they are moving forward. They are leaving the Soviet legacy behind, and they are just going further to different future, not to the Soviet future. And if you, this is the archive photo of the pioneers looking at this mosaic, and you can see the scale of it. It's quite huge, actually. And this is the sketch. And in this sketch, you can also see that the artists were quite preoccupied with also some abstract experiments. Another beautiful example of Alla Horska and her team, the Boroviter mosaic. Unfortunately, this one is again destroyed in Mariupol. This is a sketch, and you can see the real sketch behind my back. So Yevgen Nikiforov is lucky enough to own it. It used to be from a family collection, and he keeps it as a kind of talisman for his research. Another sad destiny of the, not just of separate panels, but of the huge complex which was created by the artist Ivan Litovchenko for the city of Pripyat. And the city of Pripyat is the city built specifically for the workers of Chernobyl atomic station. And after the explosion of atomic station, the whole city was evacuated. And now this is the ghost city. No one lives there for several decades. And the great mosaic panels that were created, they were created for no one, because only a couple of years had passed since they were created and before the city was evacuated. And they're still there. They're still there. They're in a more or less normal condition, but they never can be replaced because they're radioactive. And one of the, perhaps if this piece was finished, it would be the greatest, the most, the grandest example of monumental art, not only Ukraine, but perhaps in the whole world. The Wall of Memory by artist Adribachuk and Volodymyr Melnichenko. The huge 200 meters wide wall with the reliefs covered with mosaics, covered with encaustic material. The artist spent, as you can see on the dates here, spent more than 10 years working on it. And when it was on the final stage, the piece was destroyed again by government. So there is a big debate around what happened, and it deserves a separate lecture. But when the piece was almost done, almost finalized, another brigade was sent to cover this huge mosaic relief wall with this concrete wall, and then the liquid concrete was poured inside. So now this whole huge piece is covered with concrete. And to finalize my part and give a word to Yevgen, I would like to say that like recently the art of mosaics, the monumental art of Ukraine, has gained a huge popularity among the next generation of younger people, of people of my age, who never witnessed actually the Soviet times, or witnessed it as children, and were not under the impact of it. But now this art is very, very popular, very well received. People are curious about it, about its historical roots. And in the gallery I co-curated in Kiev, we did a show of the sketches of monumental art, and you can see some of them. And also I showed some of them during my presentation. And this show was so well received and so popular and so actively visited that it also gave us a hope that there is a new audience for this kind of art. And then in the future, and the future starts now actually, this kind of art will have a different context because this art is much more interesting and profound than just a subject of, than just an art on serving of Soviet propaganda. And here is the Yevgen on the photograph, and here he is behind the screen.
Yeah, hi once again. Lisa told some things about theory of monumental art, and I'll tell something more about practical things and about my research. That's me in Cherkasy Oblast a few years ago in an abandoned children camp. During 8 years, I drove around, I'd say, 80,000 kilometers all over Ukraine and discovered around 5,000 mosaics. This was my photographic project that I started in 2013. I was invited by Lizaveta German and Olga Balashova, art historians who worked on a book about art of Ukrainian 60s. And I was commissioned to make photographs of most important mosaic pieces in Kiev, and we started from this one. It's in Boryspil airport, which this part which now abandoned. The name of this mosaic is Icarus. And so I made photographs of mosaic pieces, and that's how it looks in the book called The Art of Ukrainian 60s. It was published in 2015 and 2021 in English as well by Osnowy Publishing, Kiev-based publishing house. But after this photographs, I started my research. I was interested of how many these mosaic pieces still exist in Ukraine, how many of them were created in second part of 20th century. But when I started research, I realized that there is no kind of database of these mosaics, and I need to create my own archive of these pieces and to find some methodology of research, how to find like all of them in the territory of Ukraine. And I started my research from libraries and some magazines from 60s and 70s. I started to visit Union of Artists in every region of Ukraine. I visited personally and met artists who showed me kind of archives that still exist in Union of Artists. But also I found that many of these archives were just thrown as a garbage, as a trash in 90s, because like it sounds funny, like the reason was that there was not enough space in Union of Artists, so they like throw it as a garbage. So we lost a lot of data about these pieces. And in the right bottom, there is like example of how it looks like order for a mosaic, with the explanation of with this describing of who created it, how it called, or like artists need to add something for this sketch, and so on. And it took me around like few months just to work only with one region in Ukraine, but there is 26 of this. And as I worked alone all that time, I was not able to make a research in every region, like Yeah, also I tried to find some archival photographs online or in this Union of Artists, and this is how it looks like. It's archival photographs from 80s, 70s. Yeah, sometimes it's kind of databases dedicated to architecture. I also use these archives to find some pieces that where mosaic exists. For example, this one from Lysychansk, Luhansk Oblast, but I've been there in 2017 and it was just covered because there is some image dedicated to Red Army. This photograph by photo of Claudine Dory, photographer worked in Crimea in 90s, and I found that on one of the images there is mosaic on the background, and I didn't know where it is and if it still exists or not. So I started to make research like where it is, and I found that it's in Crimea in Artek, in Crimea, which was occupied at the time already, and it was really important for me to find it personally as well. I'll tell about it a bit later. And also this photograph from the 60s, because Artek Children Camp was probably most famous one, the most important one, children camp in all Soviet Union. And it was international children camp. And on the background, there is also this image of mosaic, and I found it in 2016 and photographed it, and it still exists. Also, I made a huge research in social networks, like different ones, but one of popular was so-called Kontakte, which is forbidden now in Ukraine. But while I worked on this research, it was not forbidden. And there was many like publics where people just download their own home archives. And I made a research of thousands and thousands of photographs to find like where this mosaic is. And I asked people to help me with this location. And also, of course, I draw all the time. And at some moment, I found some kind of like rules of city building and town building, like some similar things in architecture of all the towns and villages. And I tried to search these towns from Google Maps just to understand where is the city center and to find some buildings that may exist. This mosaic pieces. For example, I found here is a triangle, and probably there is a center, and in the center there is House of Culture. And when you're making close up for this one, you can find there is a mosaic piece. And I did it thousands of times in different places where I was while I preparing to go there. Also, I made many studio visits for artists who work with monumental art, and I asked them like about the rules, how it was created, some like main things, about the rules, how they work with Soviet with Union of Artists, and how they protect their sketches in Union of Artists. For example, this is Petro Prokopiev in Ivano-Frankivsk in his studio, and he suggests me his friend Grigory Marchenko, who created mosaic in 60s in Donetsk, and I was totally shocked because I found a man, an artist who worked with Alla Horska that Lisa told before, and he showed me his archive, and it was fantastic. And he changed his name because he tried to hide him from government sometime. This is a photography from personal archive of Roman Kirichenko, and this is his father and mother. They're working on a mosaic piece, and you can see from the right side how it looks like now. And after all this research, I created kind of roots in whole Ukraine, and I started to draw. At the beginning, I used public transport, but after that, I realized that there is some like thousands of pieces that I can get only with like when you're drawing your own car, and it took a lot of time. Like as I said before, I drove around 80,000 kilometers in Ukraine in every region. Sometimes you can easily make a photographs of mosaics without any permission. Ukraine was very safe at that a few years ago. But sometimes you need to make photographs on some plant or nuclear power station, and of course you asking for permission for many times, and you need to go back to some place where permission was cancelled. This is how my Google map looks like. Actually, this is all these points are some mosaic pieces that I still didn't photograph. But as I said, there were thousands of dots that I already photographed, and all this territory are already like visited, including Crimea. And actually, when I worked on my first book, that's called Decommunized Ukrainian Soviet Mosaics, the main problem for me in 2016 was how to get photographs from occupied territories, which marked with red was in 2016, Crimea, and then some part of Donetsk and Luhansk region. And with the Crimea, I decided to, like, why it was important, because I want to like show whole territory of Ukraine in my book. And of course, I can't imagine that I can not include some mosaic pieces from Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. And I started to find some solution how to get to Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. In Crimea, I found some people who helped me, and it was also risky for them. They drove me to most important mosaic pieces. You can see it from the left. This is the Artek children camp. This photography from 60s. This one called Prometheus it's in Donetsk, and from the bottom right there is Estafeta. Liza told about it before in Luhansk region, and I tried to get there in Luhansk and Donetsk in 2016, but it was too risky. So there was a chance that I will be captured as a spy or so. So I decided that I will find the people there in Donetsk and Luhansk region and I asked them to make a photograph of these pieces, especially for me, for some money. But every people that I asked about it, they say like, we can do it for free, no worries. And they did. And I was like really impressed about it because it's also risky for them to send me such photographs. And also important thing that happened while I worked on the project was the decommunization process. It means that communist symbols were banned from public space in Ukraine in 2015. And here is some rules about which Soviet symbols are banned. And so also a very important thing for me was to do things much faster, because some of mosaics may be destroyed because of because they contain some Soviet symbols, as you can see here, and they were covered. Sometimes it were totally destroyed. Sometimes people who worked in, for example, this is the Institute for Theoretical Physics. People don't want to hide it, so they covered it with the plants, and Lenin face covered with the plants, which is funny. Sometimes people just vandalized some symbols that are which was not covered by law. So people tried to make their own dehumanization. For example, here is the Lenin portrait in Kiev subway, Kiev metro, and here is painting of mustache and hair, which Cossacks used to. And here is another example from Novovolinsk, when pioneers and the symbol of pioneers with Lenin face was just like partly destroyed. And here is another example, Nova Kakhovka, Kherson Oblast. There was a stained glass window, which like workers of this house of culture don't want to destroy, so they just cover it. And here is another example, like when mosaic were painted with yellow-blue colors as a Ukrainian flag, or just white or whatever. Or here you can see partly destroyed mosaic in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. This is a funny example, like when people just vandalizing because they don't think that this mosaic is some important thing, or when it was illegally, like reconstruction of a building here from the right, but it was made illegal to warm the wall. But just to hide this нарушение. Just to hide this, just to hide, people painted with yellow-blue flag as well. There's, as an example, Museum of Ostrovsky, which is, I'd say, which is one of the most great museums in Ukraine. One of my favorites. How it's done in how interiors are done and facade. Around 80 artists worked on a facade to cover all this building with small mosaic pieces. They worked for a few years on it, and there is fantastic exposition inside, but it's a propaganda museum. And now it's still the question is like how to save this museum, especially now, because after full-scale invasion of Russia, like dehumanization processes also became much faster, and I totally like and I support it sometimes. Yeah. But when we talk about this kind of museum, this is a unique thing. Actually, dehumanization in Ukraine, I say it starts from a decree. I worked on a project called On Republic's Monuments, dedicated to decree on the monuments of Republic in 1918, when communists, when they became to power, they started to throw all the monuments that were in Ukraine dedicated to Tsar power. Yeah, that's how dehumanization happens right now. The portraits of Lenin and Stalin in Novhorod-Siversky, and mayor of this city, he protected these portraits. He didn't want to move it to museum, but after war started, like people just don't ask him and destroy these portraits. There's another way of dehumanization, like when some images are just covered with a flag, or there's partially dehumanized, just communist symbols like covered and destroyed. Also interesting thing about current situation is the restoration. This is a river port in Kiev, and it looks like almost destroyed, and one of the first public mosaics in Kiev from 1960s in Kiev river port. And also, as for me, I saw that we lost this piece, but this year a restoration company, Gurin Brothers, they make a restoration of mosaics inside river port for American University, and that's how it must look like, the same room. And also another example from same river port. This is a sketch for Kyiv bus station, and the company Gurin Brothers, they also made the restoration of mosaics. So during last year, they invited volunteers to help with it. There was, I think, hundreds of volunteers who helped with this for the winter. And here's the working process. And it's also important that new owners of bus station, they decided to save mosaic from 60s. And it's much, much better than some modern interiors. It's totally fantastic, and I really recommend you to visit it when you in Kyiv. Really worth it. And also war, and this is the main reason, why mosaics disappear now, and like not only mosaics, of course, but all the cities and people. This is Mariupol, and photo of Yevgen Maloletka, photographer who's been there even during invasion. Inside this shop, from the right side, you can see the image of a mosaic that is still there, called Blossom Ukraine. From the left, there is photo of destroyed post office, and there was also mosaics inside. The Ukrainian Institute invited me to make research of mosaics that we used in 3D mapping visualization that you probably saw or can see today. Make the research about how these mosaics that we used in this 3D mapping, how they look like now. For example, this is the House of Culture from the left in Mariupol, and it's totally destroyed. I asked some people who are still in Mariupol to make photographs for me, but almost all of them said like it's too dangerous, and it's too dangerous also to enter the place. From the right side, there is a railway station, totally destroyed as well, and mosaic inside a burn. This is a bird of Hellas mosaic from the left, and it was probably one of 5 my favorite ones, one of the best ones that I saw. And also Tree of Life from the right side, also destroyed by shelling in Mariupol. Some of mosaics I found like by some TV shows or YouTube channels when people made news. And this is Mykolaiv Oblast. The building is totally destroyed, but parts of mosaic still exist. Also, I realized that around 25% of mosaics that we used in the 3D mapping, they are partly destroyed, totally destroyed, or occupied now. Also, one method how to find the current situation, I found some channels in YouTube when people who are still who stayed in a city while there was military actions, and they made a shooting for their phones, from window of a car how a city looks like. For example, they had a request from people, can you please show us how our home looks like? And they took a car, people inside the city, and make video from a car. And I made the screenshots from these videos because I know the cities very well, and I know where on which streets mosaic exists. So I made the screenshots how it looks like now. This is a mosaic metallurgist that Lisa showed in the beginning. This is one of the best in Mariupol, and it's totally burned now. And I don't and shell it as well, and I don't think it's possible to make the restoration of it, but I hope so. I hope we can. Lisa?
Here I am again. We're about to finish, actually. I myself was fascinated by Yevgen's presentation, actually. And I must, like in the end, I want to say two things. First of all, the reason why we are able to, myself included, to see all this mosaics documented at least is because this man actually spent 8 years of his life traveling all around Ukraine, like on weekly basis, and doing it with his own funds and his own initiative, because there was not that much commission. And we think actually, thanks to Ukrainian Institute, this project actually became much more visible internationally, because before it was more of his own private initiative, just to preserve, because he believed that this is important. And yeah, this is what I wanted to say something about that, but also the final slide from our presentation, and after that we can proceed to questions. The final slide is the huge mosaic panel of the South Ukrainian nuclear plant station in Mykolaiv region. If you remember, our presentation is called Monumental Art of Ukraine Between Two Fires. And in the beginning, we saw the fire of Azovstal factory, and now we can see the fire, like symbolic fire of the peaceful atom. And this power station is now on the Ukrainian territory, though the Mykolaiv Oblast is under heavy shelling. And also today there was the shelling of one of the smaller towns in the region was shelled. But this station is located not that far from another atomic station, which is called the Zaporizhzhia Atomic Station. It is now occupied by Russians, and it is in immediate danger of being actually fired. And if the nuclear station is destroyed, the consequences would be much more devastating than the explosion on the Chernobyl power station, a nuclear station, which we also mentioned today in the context of mosaic. So I want to use this opportunity of this lecture also to raise the international awareness once again about the danger and the possible impact of the military actions in Ukraine. Because if the power station explodes, the consequences would be much more serious than just the destruction of mosaics, because it would be like much bigger disaster than we are facing right now. But I want to, on behalf of two of us, I want to thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, we're here and we're happy to answer that. Please support Ukraine in any way you can, support Ukrainian culture, follow Ukrainian culture. There's so many other amazing topics, subjects, art pieces and artists which are worth attention. And if you just up to know something more or perhaps donate to Ukrainian art, there is the Yevgen's channel about Ukrainian mosaics where you can discover many pieces from his archive. And also there is Ukrainian Emergency Art Fund, which is the non-governmental charity organization organized by a number of Ukrainian cultural activists, curators. It's very transparent, it's very public, and it raises funds to spread it around institutions and private artists, and actually it works quite effectively. So you can follow the activities on Instagram as well as the project of Yevgen. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, we're here and we're more than happy to answer something more specific. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Yevgen. Wow, it was impressive. So many interesting facts, a deep dive into the history of Ukrainian art of the 20s and more. And I think we still have time, not too much probably, but because the museum is about to close, but for a few questions. So please raise your hand if you have a question. There's a hand.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa and Yevgen, for sharing this important work. And I have so many questions as someone who has written on Byzantium and the Renaissance and mosaics, the eternal art, as Vasari said. But a practical question, given the war. In hindsight, it seems quite prescient, this enormous effort to create an archive of this important genre of art. And so I have two questions now. Yevgen, you gave a sense of sort of the comprehensiveness of this endeavor. Is it the case that you feel that 80% of these mosaics have now been documented, 70%? What would you say in terms of creating this archive, which now is so important? And secondly, I know UNESCO and others are documenting the destruction of cultural heritage, but is there some kind of national database that is trying to, in a unified way, put together the cultural assets of the country now? So those are the two questions.
Thank you. I'd say I made photographs of most important mosaics, all the most important things here. There is also still some pieces that I didn't show them personally on occupied territories in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but I have low quality photographs that I found during all these years, just to be prepared to see it personally and to find it personally. I'd say I made photographs of around 60% of mosaics that exist in Ukraine. But there is also I have an information about, I'd say around 20% more, or 25, and around 10% of mosaics that I didn't know they exist, and because you can find something accidentally, or with the support of people who are locals and who help you to find it. And of course, I'm often thinking about it, that I might be faster and I might to work faster and to do more, but there was reasons that I didn't finish everything that I must to do. But now I feel that my work is to work with this archives that I already have, because I show in my books I showed around 300 mosaics, but there is still things to research for, not for me, for professional art historians who know and work with monumental art professionally. And so there is still things to do with this archive in the future.
As an art historian who works with this archive, I may add that statistically, as Zhenya said, as Yevgen said, maybe there is only 60% of the mosaics photographed by them. But this is the number if we talk quantity-wise. But quality-wise, I can say confidently that he documented 95% of the important pieces, because we have, for example, the panels we showed today are the masterpieces, I would say the museum level of mosaics. But then, of course, there are tens and hundreds of, let's say, lower quality and less important mosaics, which are still very interesting to document, to think about. But like number-wise, let's say we have, like using the terms of classical museum, we have like big paintings, and then we have like some sketches or some works by like minor artists, which are interesting from a historical point of view, but they are less valuable from the artistic point of view. So in this case, I think Yevgen documented like 95% of something which really constitutes the face of the Ukrainian monumental art. So the most important pieces are documented. Anna, can I please ask you to repeat the second question?
Yes, first of all, that's fantastic, and we're so grateful. Yes, the second question is, of course, UNESCO is and others are documenting the destruction of cultural heritage, but is there some sort of unified effort in Ukraine or internationally to put together a database of cultural heritage that would draw together, say, the researches that you're doing with others, or is that still yet to come? Because I know a number of us would be interested in trying to support that.
Yeah, that's a complex question. I mean, if talking about like monumental art precisely, before the war, there were several initiatives, a part of Yevgen's project that bothered to document, to research, and also to protect. For example, there is initiative the Nitin Brishak and Yevgenia Moller, our colleagues, who worked more on a like legal side, who really wrote letters, addressed letters to governments in order to protect several pieces, or if some of the piece would be like right now in the destruction. For example, there is a building with a mosaic, and then the building is sold to some private business, and the business tries to demolish the mosaic. These activists would go there and just negotiate in legal terms with the owner, trying to prevent the mosaic from destruction. Then there was the database of mosaics of Zhytomyr region, initiated by the local festival. But then there is no like one unified database. And unfortunately, if speaking about mosaics particularly, there was no government initiative, because again, so mosaics, because they were created during Soviet times, they are sort of how you say it in English, like beyond the law of protection. They are not recognized. They're not listed they're not recognized as a heritage. And this when we say that it becomes more popular and more of an interest for younger generation, it's because there are several private initiatives, artistic initiatives, like something like Yevgen does, which attract the attention. But on an official level, mosaics are beyond the law. They're not protected in any way. If a person buys a building for a supermarket, let's say, and he or she or the business decides to take the mosaic away, even if this mosaic belongs to Alla Horska, who's a superstar, still there is no legal reason for him not to remove it, because even the copyright in this case is disputed, because it's a subject of dispute, because there is an artist and there is artist family who owns the copyright. But then again, because this piece was commissioned by the Soviet government like 50 years ago, there is a chance legal wise that the copyright is not a subject of a private person but of a state. So it's a complex question, and there are people who taken care about it, but it's not unified, and officially it's not protected. And if to talk about the cultural heritage of Ukraine, not only from the 20th century, but more general, the Minister of Culture and the Deputy Minister of Culture, Katerina Chuva, who herself is an expert of the heritage and who spent many years working in the sphere of heritage protection, she is doing a lot to document, she and her team doing a lot to document it, to protect what's being under the danger, because of course not only mosaics are being destroyed, there are museums, there are old churches, there are pieces of architecture of different historical periods which are now being destroyed. So what we show today is just a bit of the complete picture. Of course, there is many, many more things to protect, take care about. So perhaps this is the question. I mean, I'm not like 100% aware of the process that Ministry of Culture is now leading on in terms of heritage protection. But if we speak about the particular mosaics, unfortunately, they are not protected at all. They haven't been protected before the war, and they're not protected now in legal terms, unfortunately.
And to add a little bit to it, I have to say that the Minister of Culture has recorded, I think, 464 objects of the Ukrainian cultural heritage destroyed or severely damaged in the last 6 months, and this list is added to what has been destroyed in the previous 8 years of Russian war over Ukraine. And I would like to also say that we in the Ukrainian Institute are doing a project to kind of bring awareness about the losses, the cultural losses of Ukraine. The project is called Postcards from Ukraine, where we pick the most speaking, the most prominent cultural objects that were destroyed, and we show how they used to look like before the invasion, what happened to them now. We tell the story and we promote it through different media. So also trying to bring attention to that issue. And coming back to the mosaics and protection of the mosaics, yes, they are not yet listed as on the heritage protection list, and the legislation on heritage protection is not extended to mosaics, but there was a huge discussion about that prior the invasion, and the Minister of Culture was part of that discussion. And, there were several steps, just a way of recognizing it as our cultural heritage. But of course, the consensus in the society, especially in the cultural community, is quite obvious. We realize how precious these things are and how important it is to save this part of heritage. This is why we in Ukrainian Institute chose this particular medium, this particular genre for our projection 3 years ago, and this is why we're continuing to work with it.
And we cannot be really more grateful to Ukrainian Institute and to all the partners involved in this, who made this lecture possible, because this is so important to really spread awareness about this particular part of our very rich, very diverse culture, perhaps controversial sometimes, because the Soviet period is controversial. There is a big homework for all of us here in Ukraine to be done to find the right place to interpret this art. But this is obvious, and I thank you, Tatiana, for also pointing that this is our heritage. It does matter. That is valuable.
Any last question, remarks? No? Thank you so much. Thank you, Lisa, Yevgen. Thank you for your amazing job, and thank you for sharing so generously with us tonight about your knowledge and your expertise. And we are about to see tonight the last 4 screenings of the show. So you're all welcome to come at 8:30, 9, 9:30, and 10, just across the street to the Wren building to see the live mosaics, the animated mosaics, the quarter of which have unfortunately been destroyed already in the past 6 months. Thank you so much. And also, support Ukraine through the Ukrainian Emergency Art Fund. They are also partners of our project, and we are asking to donate to their funds, and they will then share these donations with Ukrainian artists. And this way we will, not allow to eliminate another generation of Ukrainian art by Russians. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.
Very much. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Enjoy the screening tonight.